The day I married my sister's husband, her little girl stood only a few feet away from me, holding a photograph of the mother she would never see again. And as I walked toward the man who had once promised my sister forever, I could feel people staring at me like I had committed the ultimate betrayal. Some refused to attend the wedding. Others came only because they wanted to see whether I would really go through with it. But the question that hurt the most was the one nobody needed to say aloud. Had I fallen in love with Nathan because I wanted my sister's life? Or had Nathan fallen in love with me because every time he looked into my face, he saw the woman he had buried? I wish I could tell you the answer was simple. It wasn't. Because 2 years earlier, I had held Danielle's hand in a hospital room and promised her I would never abandon her daughter. I just never imagined keeping that promise would eventually lead me to her husband. My name is Maya Carter, and before Nathan Whitmore became my husband, he was simply the man my older sister loved more than anyone in the world. Danielle was 8 years older than me, but people often assumed we were much closer in age because we looked remarkably alike. We had the same deep brown eyes, the same cheekbones, almost the same smile, and whenever we stood beside each other in family photographs, people sometimes joked that our parents had somehow produced the same daughter twice. But anyone who knew us understood how different we were. Danielle was fearless. She could enter a room full of strangers and somehow leave knowing everybody's name. I was quieter, happier, standing somewhere near the wall and observing. Danielle knew what she wanted early in life. I was still trying to figure myself out when everything changed. And the strangest part is that if Danielle had not become sick, Nathan and I might have remained exactly what we were supposed to be. Family. Nothing more. Before we go further, there is something I want you to remember. When people heard what eventually happened between Nathan and me, most of them judged the ending without knowing the beginning. They saw a younger sister marrying her dead sister's husband, and for some people, that was enough. They didn't see the hospital corridors. They didn't see a 3-year-old child waking up at midnight crying for her mother. They didn't see Nathan sitting alone at a kitchen table staring at a cup of coffee he had forgotten to drink. And they certainly didn't see how desperately I tried to convince myself that the feelings developing between us could never be allowed to exist. So as you hear my story, ask yourself one question. Where exactly would you say the line was crossed? Was it the moment I stayed after Danielle died? Was it the moment Nathan started depending on me? Or was it much later, when 2 grieving people finally admitted that something between them had changed? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Danielle met Nathan when she was 26. By then, I was still a teenager, worried about school, college applications, friendships, and everything else that feels enormous when you are young. Nathan was already successful. He was tall, strikingly handsome, polished without trying too hard, and the kind of man people seemed to notice the second he entered a room. His company had grown rapidly, and although I didn't understand much about the business world at the time, I understood enough to know he was extremely wealthy. But Danielle never spoke about his money the way other people did. When I once teased her about marrying a handsome CEO, she laughed and told me that the impressive version of Nathan everybody else saw was not the man she knew at home. The man she loved was the one who made breakfast badly and still insisted on trying. At first, our parents were cautious. Danielle was their oldest daughter, and Nathan came from a completely different background. We were a Black American family that had built everything slowly and carefully. Nathan was white, wealthy, connected, and accustomed to rooms where important decisions were made before most people even knew the meeting had begun. My father, Robert, worried that Danielle might eventually feel like an outsider in Nathan's world. My mother, Linda, worried about everything mothers worry about when their daughter says she is in love. But Nathan surprised them. He never behaved like he was doing our family a favor by accepting us. He remembered birthdays. He showed up. He sat with my father for hours talking about everything from business to baseball. When he married Danielle, my father stood at the reception and said he had not lost a daughter, he had gained a son. Years later, those words would return to our family in a way none of us could have imagined. Their marriage seemed happy. I know people say that about almost every marriage after something tragic happens, but with Danielle and Nathan, there was never a scandal hiding in the background. They argued about ordinary things. Nathan worked too much sometimes. Danielle could be stubborn, but they loved each other openly, and when Emma was born, Nathan seemed to become a different person. This billionaire CEO who could intimidate senior executives with a single look would come home and spend 20 minutes crawling around the floor because his daughter wanted him to pretend he was a horse. Danielle used to send me photographs of them constantly. Nathan asleep on the couch with Emma on his chest. Nathan struggling to fasten a tiny pink shoe. Nathan carrying both Danielle's purse and the diaper bag without complaining. I envied my sister sometimes, but never in the way people later accused me of. I didn't want her husband. I wanted what she had, a home where love seemed safe. They had been married for about 3 years when my mother called me one evening and asked whether I was sitting down. I remember laughing because it sounded overly dramatic, and I told her I was fine. Then she said Danielle was in the hospital. At first, I assumed it was something temporary. Danielle had been exhausted for weeks, losing weight and complaining about pain. She kept dismissing because she was busy raising Emma and handling her own work. Nathan had finally insisted she see another physician when she became too weak to finish a family dinner. More tests followed, then more specialists. What began as concern became fear. What became fear soon turned into a diagnosis none of us were prepared to hear. Danielle had an advanced illness, and by the time doctors understood the full extent of it, treatment was no longer about simply making her well. It was about buying time. Nathan immediately behaved like money could somehow negotiate with death. He contacted specialists. He sought additional opinions. He was prepared to send Danielle anywhere if someone could give them even a slightly better possibility. Our family prayed. Friends prayed. People who had never met Danielle heard about her situation and began sending messages of support. Nathan never complained about the cost because the cost meant nothing to him. If somebody had told him his entire company could be exchanged for another 20 years with Danielle, I honestly believe he would have signed the papers that afternoon. But wealth has limits, and sitting in that hospital taught me something I had never understood before. There are rooms where the poorest person and the richest person become exactly the same. When a doctor closes a door and says there is nothing more money can change, the size of your bank account suddenly becomes irrelevant. Nathan could control thousands of employees, negotiate deals worth millions, and command attention in any boardroom he entered. Yet he could not command Danielle's body to heal. I had just finished high school when my parents asked me to go and stay near Danielle. They were getting older, and traveling back and forth was becoming difficult. My mother wanted desperately to remain beside her daughter, but there were responsibilities at home and health concerns of her own. I had also been searching for opportunities that could give me some experience before deciding exactly what I wanted to study. The arrangement seemed temporary. I would help with Emma, spend time with Danielle, and make myself useful until things improved. At least, that was the version of the future we were still allowing ourselves to believe. The first time I walked into Danielle's hospital room after hearing how serious things were, I nearly turned around. My sister had always seemed larger than life to me. Now she looked painfully small beneath the sheets. She saw my expression immediately and smiled, almost as if she needed to protect me from what was happening to her. That first night, I waited until I left her room before I cried. Nathan found me sitting alone at the end of the hospital corridor. He didn't try to comfort me with promises because, by then, promises sounded dishonest. He simply sat beside me. For several minutes, neither of us said anything. Then he told me Danielle had been asking about Emma all day. Their daughter was too young to understand why mommy had suddenly disappeared into a place full of machines and strangers. Sometimes Emma could visit. Other times, she couldn't. So I began spending more time with her. We had nannies in the house, and Nathan could have hired 10 more if he wanted to. What Emma needed, however, was someone she recognized, She knew me. She trusted me. She had been calling me Aunt Maya since she could form the words. Slowly, my days became organized around a little girl who kept asking the one question I could never answer properly. When was mommy coming home? That question followed me everywhere. Emma would ask while eating breakfast. She would ask while I brushed her hair. She would ask when a car pulled into the driveway because she thought perhaps her mother had returned. I became skilled at changing the subject without making promises. At night, when she became restless, I would lie beside her and tell stories until she fell asleep. Then I would sometimes stand in the doorway, wondering what would happen if Danielle never walked through that house again. Nathan was usually at the hospital. Some mornings I would see him return wearing the same clothes he had worn the previous day. He would shower, change, make a few calls, and go back. The company continued because people beneath him kept it moving, but anyone could see that the business had become almost meaningless to him. His entire world had narrowed to one hospital room, one sick wife, and one little girl who did not understand what she was about to lose. Danielle understood, though. That was what made those final months so difficult. There came a point when we stopped speaking around her as though she didn't know. She knew the treatments were failing. She knew Nathan was exhausted. She knew Emma was becoming more attached to me because I was the woman who was physically present most often. One afternoon, when Nathan had stepped out and the room was unusually quiet, Danielle asked me to close the door. She took my hand and told me she needed a promise. I refused before she even finished the sentence because I knew what kind of conversation was coming. She smiled and told me that refusing to hear something would not make it disappear. Then she asked me to stay in Emma's life if she didn't survive. Not for a month. Not until everyone recovered. She meant permanently. She wanted her daughter to grow up connected to her side of the family. I told Danielle she was going to tell Emma all of those things herself. She squeezed my hand and said she hoped so. But then she asked again. She wanted my word, so I gave it to her. I promised that no matter where life took me, Emma would always have me. Danielle relaxed after that. She never told me to take her place. She never asked me to marry Nathan. She never suggested that something romantic could ever develop between us. I need that understood because when people later discovered what happened, stories began changing. Some relatives decided Danielle must have somehow arranged it. Others suggested I had secretly been waiting. Neither was true. Danielle asked only one thing of me: love her daughter. And when I promised, I believed I understood what that promise meant. I thought it meant phone calls, birthdays, weekends, school programs, and family holidays. I did not understand that the promise would keep me inside a house where every room carried my sister's memory. Danielle died early one morning. There was no dramatic final speech, no miraculous last-minute recovery. Her body had simply reached the end of what it could endure. Nathan was beside her. I was there too, standing farther back because that moment belonged to them. When the machines changed and the people around us began moving with the quiet urgency medical workers have during moments families never forget, Nathan kept holding Danielle's hand. I remember watching him and realizing I had never seen a human being look so completely defeated. This was a man people described as powerful. Newspapers had written about his success. Employees waited for his decisions. Investors listened when he spoke. But in that room, Nathan was just a husband whose wife was gone. And I was just a younger sister who suddenly understood that every memory I had with Danielle was now something I could never repeat. The funeral passed like a dream I could not wake from. People came from everywhere. Business associates, old friends, relatives, neighbors, people Danielle had known years earlier. They spoke about her kindness and her laughter. They told Nathan how strong he needed to be for Emma. They hugged me and said I had to take care of myself. Everyone had advice for grief because advice is easier when you are going home afterward. When the funeral ended, everybody slowly returned to their lives. Nathan and Emma could not. Neither could I. I had planned to return to my parents, but the first night I began packing, Emma saw my suitcase and became hysterical. She wrapped both arms around my leg and begged me not to leave. That was the moment my temporary stay became something else. I told myself I would remain a few more weeks. A few weeks became several months. And without realizing it, I began building a routine inside my dead sister's home. Nathan and I barely spoke about anything personal during those early months. That detail matters. Our relationship was not romantic. He treated me like family, sometimes even like a younger sister. We discussed Emma, schedules, meals, appointments, and practical things that had to be done because children do not stop needing breakfast simply because the adults around them are grieving. Nathan moved through the house like a visitor. He rarely entered the bedroom he had shared with Danielle. Her clothes remained in the closet. Her perfume remained on the dresser. Photographs stayed everywhere. Sometimes I wondered whether preserving everything exactly as she had left it was helping him or destroying him, but I never considered it my place to ask. I had my own grief. Some mornings I would instinctively pick up my phone to call Danielle before remembering there was nobody to answer. And then I would hear Emma laughing downstairs and force myself to move. Several months after the funeral, Nathan asked what I planned to do with my future. I told him I was still searching for an internship and trying to decide which direction I wanted to pursue. He offered to help, and my first instinct was to refuse because I did not want people thinking I was living in his house and receiving opportunities because I was his late wife's sister. Nathan understood the concern. Instead of creating some glamorous position for me, he arranged for me to interview properly for an entry-level internship inside one division of his company. I would report to managers who were not Nathan. I would learn, make mistakes, and be evaluated like everybody else. I accepted. For the first time since Danielle became ill, I began to feel as though my life had direction again. I was taking care of Emma, but I was also becoming something beyond the grieving younger sister everyone felt sorry for. Working inside Nathan's company changed the way I saw him. At home, he was a tired father who sometimes forgot where he had left his keys. At work, he was completely different. People prepared before entering meetings with him. He was focused, direct, and incredibly demanding. Employees respected him, and some clearly feared disappointing him. I also began understanding why Danielle had been proud of what he built. Nathan was not simply a handsome rich man who happened to inherit an easy life. He worked constantly. For months, however, our lives remained separate. I avoided his office unless my work required it. At home, we ate with Emma. Afterward, I went to my part of the house and he went to his. If anyone had told me then that I would someday marry him, I would have been offended. Nathan belonged in my mind beside Danielle. Even after her death, separating the two of them felt impossible. Then one evening, something happened that frightened me more than I wanted to admit. Emma had gone to bed. I came downstairs and found Nathan sitting alone with one of Danielle's old photo albums open in front of him. He had been drinking, although he wasn't drunk. He asked whether I remembered the day one photograph was taken. I did. Soon we were talking about Danielle, telling stories we had both heard 100 times. Nathan laughed for perhaps the first time in weeks. Then he became quiet. I reached across the table and touched his hand because he looked like he was about to cry. Nathan looked up at me, and for a few seconds something in his expression changed. Then he whispered my sister's name. Danielle. One word. That was all. I pulled my hand away immediately. Nathan realized what he had done and apologized, but I went upstairs without answering. I barely slept. It wasn't because Nathan had intentionally done anything wrong. He had made a mistake during grief, but that mistake placed a fear inside me. Danielle and I looked alike. Everyone knew it. What if my presence in the house was keeping Nathan trapped? What if every time he saw me caring for Emma, walking through the kitchen or sitting across from him, some part of him was seeing the life he had lost? The next morning, Nathan apologized again. He looked embarrassed and deeply ashamed. I told him we should forget it, and for a while we did. I became more careful. I spent additional time outside the house. I focused on work. Nathan never crossed a boundary. Months passed, and the incident slowly became one of those memories you lock away because examining it too closely creates questions you do not want answered. What I didn't know was that our lives were already beginning to move in a direction neither of us had planned. Time has a strange relationship with grief. In the beginning, you count hours, then days. Eventually, you realize an anniversary is approaching and cannot understand how an entire year passed. By the first anniversary of Danielle's death, Emma had changed significantly. She still talked about her mother, but many of her memories came from photographs and stories. Nathan had begun functioning again. He attended events. He worked normal hours when possible. He started laughing without looking guilty afterward. I had grown too. I was no longer the frightened teenager who arrived carrying a suitcase and expecting my sister to recover. I was performing well at the company and beginning to earn respect independently. Nathan noticed that change, though at first I thought nothing of it. We discussed work more often. Sometimes we disagreed. I stopped treating every opinion he offered like an order. To my surprise, he seemed to enjoy being challenged. The first moment I wondered whether Nathan's feelings had changed came because of another man. His name was Ryan, a young employee who worked in a department close to mine. Ryan was funny, confident, and uncomplicated, which was exactly what my life needed. When he asked me to dinner, I agreed. I didn't tell Nathan because there was no reason to. He was my brother-in-law, not my father. But one evening, Ryan arrived at the house to pick me up, and Nathan happened to be downstairs. I introduced them. Nathan was polite. Too polite. The kind of politeness that made every word sound carefully selected. During dinner, Ryan joked that my brother-in-law had looked at him like he was reviewing an acquisition he had already decided not to approve. I laughed, but I kept thinking about it. When I returned home, Nathan was still awake. He asked whether I had enjoyed myself. I said yes. Then he nodded and went upstairs. Nothing happened. That was what confused me. Nathan never told me not to see Ryan. He never criticized him. But I began noticing things I might previously have ignored. The way Nathan sometimes watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. The sudden pauses in ordinary conversations. The way he became unusually quiet whenever I mentioned dating. I started feeling guilty for noticing. This was Danielle's husband. Yes, she was gone, but that sentence did not make the connection disappear. I began asking myself questions I hated. Was Nathan lonely, or did he genuinely care about me? Was I imagining everything because I had been living in this unusual situation for too long? Worse, what did it say about me that instead of being disgusted by the possibility, a small part of me had begun wondering what it would feel like if Nathan actually said the words? I tried creating distance. I spent more evenings away. I visited my parents more often. I continued seeing Ryan, although it never developed into anything serious. Nathan did not interfere. In some ways, his restraint made everything harder because it meant I could not make him the villain. Nearly 2 years had passed since Danielle's death, when Nathan and I finally had the conversation that changed our family forever. It happened after we had both visited Danielle's grave on the anniversary of her death. I had gone earlier, believing I would be alone, but Nathan arrived before I left. We stood there talking about how much Emma had grown. Then Nathan told me there was something he needed to say. I knew immediately. My entire body seemed to understand before my mind allowed the possibility. I told him not to say it. He remained quiet for several seconds. Then he said that silence had not made the feelings disappear. Nathan told me he believed he was falling in love with me. Hearing the words felt completely different from imagining them. I became angry, not because I hated him, but because some part of me had been terrified he would confirm exactly what I suspected. I reminded him that I was Danielle's sister. He said he knew. I asked whether that was the reason. Nathan looked confused. So I asked the question directly. Was he attracted to me because I looked like my sister? Was I simply the closest thing he could find to bringing Danielle back? His answer was not romantic. He admitted that during the earliest stages of grief, my resemblance to Danielle had sometimes been difficult for him. He admitted there were moments when seeing me from a distance could bring back memories. Then he said the sentence that stayed with me. He told me, "You are not Danielle, Maya, and I know that now more than anyone." I left before we could finish the conversation. For almost 2 weeks, I avoided being alone with Nathan. Then I told my mother. I expected shock. I was not prepared for the way she looked at me. Her first question was whether anything had happened while Danielle was alive. I felt as though she had slapped me. I asked how she could possibly believe that about me. She said she wasn't accusing me. She needed to know. But once a question like that enters a room, you cannot pretend it was never asked. I told her absolutely nothing had happened. Nathan had loved Danielle. I had loved Danielle. There had been no affair, no secret conversations, and no hidden plan. My father reacted even more strongly. To him, Nathan was still Danielle's husband. Death had not changed that emotionally. He told me there were millions of men in the world and asked why I would choose the one man who could divide our family. News moved through the family quickly. People who had once praised me for helping Emma began looking at my decision differently. Suddenly, my years in Nathan's house became suspicious. My internship became suspicious. Every photograph became evidence of something that had never happened. Some relatives convinced themselves Nathan and I must have been emotionally involved before Danielle died. Others believed Nathan was confused and using me as a substitute. A few people were cruel enough to say I had stepped into my sister's home, raised her daughter, taken a job from her husband, and finally decided to take the husband too. Those words nearly destroyed me because from the outside, I understood how the story looked. I knew the truth of each individual decision. But place all of those decisions in one sentence, and they sounded very different. For the first time, I wondered whether loving Nathan could ever be worth what it might cost. So I left. I moved out of Nathan's house and eventually transferred away from the part of the company that kept us in regular contact. Nathan did not try to stop me. That mattered. He told me that if the only way I could discover what I truly wanted was to build a life away from him, then that was what I should do. He refused to turn Emma against me or use her attachment to make me stay. I rented a small apartment and began living alone for the first time. At first, it felt freeing. Nobody was watching. Nobody could accuse me of pretending to be Danielle. I dated. I made friends. I tried to create the life my family believed would solve everything. But something had changed permanently. I missed Emma desperately. And although I hated admitting it, I missed Nathan too. Not his mansion, not his company, not his money. I missed the person I had come to know when there was nobody else in the room. For months, Nathan and I remained apart, except when I spent time with Emma. Then, one afternoon, Emma asked me a question I still remember. She wanted to know whether she had done something wrong that made me leave. I immediately told her no. She asked why I didn't live with them anymore, if I loved her. Trying to explain adult grief, boundaries, and family judgment to a child was impossible. I held her and told her that sometimes grown-ups needed space to understand things. She asked whether I was coming back. I couldn't answer. That night, I cried harder than I had in months. I realized I had been so consumed by what everybody thought about Nathan and me that I had forgotten the promise at the beginning of all of this. Danielle had asked me to remain in her daughter's life. Whatever happened between Nathan and me, Emma could not become collateral damage. Around that time, my mother gave me something Danielle had written during the months she was ill. It wasn't a secret letter predicting the future. Danielle had not somehow known I would fall in love with Nathan. It was simply a message she had prepared for me because she understood she might not survive. Most of it was about our childhood, our parents, and Emma. But near the end, Danielle wrote something that changed the way I had been thinking. She told me not to build my future around her death. She said that loving her did not require me to stop living. Those words were not permission to marry Nathan. I would never pretend they were. But they reminded me that I had turned my sister into an invisible judge standing over every decision I made. Danielle had loved me. She had wanted a future for me. And I began asking myself whether refusing Nathan automatically honored her more than loving him did. When I finally agreed to speak with Nathan again, I made him answer the hardest question one more time. I asked what he saw when he looked at me. Nathan did not rush his answer. He told me Danielle would always be part of his life because she was his first wife and Emma's mother. He would never stop loving the years they had shared. But he said grief had taught him that loving someone who died and loving someone still alive were not competing acts. Then he told me he loved me because of the woman I had become, not because of the woman I resembled. I believed him. Perhaps some viewers listening to this would not. My father certainly did not at first. Several relatives never did. But relationships are ultimately lived by the people inside them, not the people standing outside trying to decide what each feeling means. Nathan and I did not marry immediately. That was important to me. We dated slowly and for a while, privately. I wanted to know what our relationship looked like when it was no longer built around emergency, illness, or shared grief. I wanted to discover whether we could actually function as two adults rather than two survivors of the same loss. There were difficult moments. The first time Nathan kissed me, I cried afterward. The first time we attended a formal event together, I spent the entire night wondering whether everyone was comparing me with Danielle. Sometimes Nathan would mention a memory of my sister, and I would feel jealousy, followed immediately by guilt for feeling jealous of a dead woman I had loved. We eventually learned that moving forward did not mean pretending those emotions did not exist. It meant speaking about them before they became resentment. Emma remained at the center of everything. I refused to allow our relationship to erase Danielle from her own daughter's story. Photographs remained in the house. We celebrated Danielle's birthday by remembering her. When Emma asked questions about her mother, we answered them. I never encouraged her to call me Mom. I was Aunt Maya before I was anything else. And I believed Emma deserved control over what our relationship became. Over time, she began understanding that loving me did not require choosing between us. That may have been the lesson the adults struggled to learn. Everybody seemed obsessed with the idea that there was only one position available in the family, as though I could enter only by pushing Danielle out. But Danielle was gone physically, and still she remained everywhere that mattered. In Emma, in Nathan's memories, in my memories, in our parents, and in the history of the family. When Nathan proposed, I did not say yes immediately. I went home to my parents. My father and I had one of the longest conversations we had ever shared. I told him I knew how the marriage would look. I knew some people would never accept it. But I asked him whether he genuinely believed I had betrayed Danielle, or whether he was simply uncomfortable because our situation did not fit the rules he had always assumed families followed. My father cried. I had rarely seen him cry, even at Danielle's funeral. He admitted that part of his anger came from fear. Seeing me with Nathan made Danielle's absence feel fresh again. It felt as though life was continuing without asking his permission. Eventually, he told me he could not decide my future for me. He still needed time, but he did not want to lose another daughter because he was unable to release the first. My mother reached acceptance sooner. She told me something I wish I had understood earlier. Nobody could replace Danielle. Not me, not another woman, not anyone. Nathan might someday marry. Replacement was never truly the question. The question was whether we believed love was allowed to take a new form after loss. That did not make everything comfortable. Some relatives declined the wedding invitation. A few openly criticized my parents for supporting us. People online who learned fragments of the story formed their own conclusions. But by then, I understood something about judgment. People usually receive your life as a summary. They do not experience the thousands of ordinary moments between the dramatic ones. They hear, "She married her dead sister's husband." 6 words. And those 6 words become more powerful than the years that came before them. Which brings me back to the day I described at the beginning. I stood in my wedding dress preparing to marry Nathan, while my sister's daughter waited nearby. For a moment, I looked at Emma and wondered whether Danielle would have hated what I was about to do. I wish I could tell you I received some perfect sign that erased every doubt. I didn't. Life rarely gives answers that clean. Instead, my mother approached me and adjusted part of my dress. She must have recognized the fear on my face because she told me quietly that I was not replacing my sister. I asked how she could be certain. My mother looked at me as if the answer should have been obvious. She said nobody could replace Danielle. Then she kissed my forehead and walked away. Those words were enough to get me through the door. Nathan was waiting at the other end of the aisle. For everyone else, it may have looked like the controversial wedding between a widower and his late wife's younger sister. To me, it was the end of a journey that had begun in a hospital corridor when none of us knew what survival would demand. Emma walked ahead of me. She carried flowers, and attached discreetly to her bouquet was a tiny photograph of Danielle. That had been Emma's idea. I almost said no, because I worried people would think it was strange. Then I realized worrying about other people had already controlled enough of our lives. Danielle was Emma's mother. She was my sister. She was Nathan's first wife. Marriage would not rewrite any of that. So the photograph remained. And when Nathan saw it, he cried. Not because he regretted marrying me, but because happiness and grief